You know, I really should read more indie comics. They offer certain freedom and creativity that you don't see very often in the big two publishers. With creator-owned work, you get to see the team's full, unfiltered vision on display, and it just so happens I got the perfect opportunity to talk about one such comic, Before We Sail. Before We Sail tells a deeply intimate story of two people struggling with their new reality as their home of Lima, Peru is hit by the zombie apocalypse. This one was a bit of a surprise because it marks the first time someone who worked on the book reached out to me directly to cover their work. The writer, Carlos Yacolca, I am so sorry if I mispronounced that, sent me an advance copy to promote Before We Sail's release, and I'm letting you guys know a few things up front because of this. 1. This is an advance copy, meaning the full thing isn't released yet by the time of recording, so I'll be keeping spoilers to an absolute minimum to respect that. If I absolutely have to discuss anything too spoilery, I'll put up a timestamp and give ample time for you guys to click away. 2. This is not a sponsored video, as I'm not being paid to promote anything. He simply asked me politely to cover it and give my opinion as we go. And I even asked beforehand if he specifically wanted me to just paint a positive picture of it all. He's given me full consent to discuss everything, warts and all, so I could shred this thing to friggin' pieces if I ended up hating it. Suffice to say, all my opinions are legit. I'm not sugarcoating anything just because I was asked to review it. Anyway, let's get into this thing. As usual, we'll start with the creative team behind the pages. First up, we've got the writer, the aforementioned Carlos Yacolca. Prior to this, he owned a local comic book shop in his area, but this is his very first published work in the industry. It's quite exciting seeing fresh faces break in. On art duties, we've got Michelle Lino. I could not for the life of me find any info on her, which leads me to believe that this is also her first published work on comics as well. I did see references to a local Haunts zine and illustrations for books under a Ojos de Papel imprint, but I wasn't able to find anything for either of those, unfortunately. Lettering is done by Diego Relevo, and the team's editor is Alberto Rayo. The comic's logo was whipped up by one David Escobedo, and I gotta say, excellent job, it's simple but effective. Also, once again, I am so sorry to the entire team if I have mispronounced any of your names, I tried my best here. Last but not least, you may have noticed all this talk of reviewing a comic not from one of the big comic publishers, but not specifying who did publish this. This isn't a self-published venture per se, rather through the digital-only magazine Aces Weekly, run by one David Lloyd. And this is what initially grabbed my attention when Carlos reached out to me. Even if you don't know David Lloyd by name, I can guarantee you've seen his work before. David Lloyd, where have I heard that name before? Oh my god. That's right, he was the artist behind V for Vendetta, and the guy who designed the Guy Fawkes mask. Yeah, guy's kind of an unspoken legend in the comic world, and Aces Weekly is a sort of anthology magazine dedicated to showing off new creators just breaking into the industry. So if you want to see something fresh that you're just not getting from more well-known companies, this might be worth checking out. Okay, now that we've introduced all the contributors who made this happen, onto the comic itself. As I mentioned earlier, Before We Sail is a story set in a zombie apocalypse. I was initially not sure if I'd be able to do this justice because I'm really not much of a zombie guy. Nothing wrong with zombie stuff, it's just not a genre that generally interests me. But the important thing here is that the zombie hordes aren't the focus of this story, it's our protagonists, Jonathan and Kath, which I assume is short for Catherine. In fact, the amount of pages where any zombies can be clearly seen in full view can be counted on one hand. So if you were wanting a cool zombie action story starring unstoppable badasses mowing down entire hordes, this ain't that. But I will say though, what we do see of the zombies is neat. While it isn't spelled out, they appear to be virus-based rather than the undead variety. No rotting flesh to be seen, but rather these dark, bulging veins. It seems the infection doesn't spread by just biting someone, but rather some kind of spore they release into the air. And the veins appear to act as a sort of root system when the individual zombie has outlived its usefulness. Kind of like cordyceps, come to think of it. It's never elaborated on how exactly the zombies operate or how the outbreak started, likely due to the comic's relatively short runtime, but that's perfectly fine in my opinion. Knowing what exactly they are, or what led up to this, really doesn't matter to what's important. Carlos set out to tell a story that ultimately relates to mental health in a lot of ways. He specifically calls out the feeling of not being able to change your situation or the world you live in, but I think it goes a little bit deeper than that. I read this entire story beginning to end no less than 4 times while writing this page of the script, also staring at my wall for good measure for well over an hour as I tried to put my finger on it. While that feeling of helplessness is a symptom, I didn't feel like that was the core overarching theme here. My impression was that this story isn't necessarily about how bad the situation is, but how different people cope with it differently. Not to say I know more about this story than its own writer, I just walked away with a slightly different takeaway here. People are all unique and complex and don't always react the same way to what seems like an unwinnable situation. One specific feeling Carlos called out is depersonalization, which I found to be quite common in periods of high stress. When something gets bad enough in either the world at large or in one's own life, it's so easy to just stop seeing people as people and instead obstacles or threats to yourself, or even just objects or assets to use, such as Jonathan not being entirely sure on if the zombies are still people inside, or just mindless monsters to be put down. One character even refuses to call one of his victims by her name and instead just as her, because if he acknowledged her name, he'd be forced to see her as a person and not just a resource. We see a lot of similar detachment throughout the story. Most people here routinely have this attitude of why should we care, we don't know them, as if only those in your inner circle are worth basic human empathy. Anyone else isn't worth a second thought. One of our 2 protagonists, Kath, exemplifies this fairly well. She displays what's a fairly common reaction to a hard time, which is to put up walls and focus on your own goals. Everyone else just trying to survive is over there, and over there can take care of its own problems. On the other hand, we have Jonathan, who seems to develop a sort of hero complex, brought on by finding the aftermath of someone who... Oh, I can't actually say this on YouTube, that's right. Someone who, canceled his subscription to being alive. Jonathan has no idea what would even be the appropriate reaction to reading one of those cancellation notices, and to be honest, I can't blame him. I have no idea how I'd react to finding one. After that, he becomes borderline obsessed with saving everyone he meets, to the point where it's actively dangerous to his own well-being, just because he can't handle anyone else dying, which I will say is quite noble in his intentions. I know there are people out there who just want to make a difference in their community in times of crisis. Only his main problem here is he's got his own mental problems that need to be sorted out first before he can make an effective difference. Put on your own oxygen mask before helping someone else put theirs on and all that. Speaking of mental health, I was convinced that Jonathan had been infected and was going to turn by the end. There are numerous references to him needing some kind of drug in order to keep functioning, which I assumed meant preventing him from becoming a zombie, but no. It's just medication for whatever he's got rattling around in there. PTSD, if I had to guess. Unclear on whether it's something he suffered from before the outbreak or something caused by the outbreak and having to survive hell on Earth. And last one I want to talk about in detail is Ailes, the closest thing to a main antagonist here. He's something I've seen all too much of. Someone who will commit horrific acts against others because he's convinced himself that he's justified to do so. As the man says so himself, it's only the people you care for that count. And I won't necessarily say he's entirely wrong. It's something I think anyone would tell themselves in a similar position. In his mind, he's only doing what he needs to for his group to survive. If that just so happens to have a negative outcome for other survivors, well, that sucks. And that's the great thing about this, as well as a lot of survival stories in general. No one feels like an outright villain. Every character just feels human, and at no point did I find myself saying, well, where did this come from? Why are they acting like this? The reactions all feel completely natural given the situation, even if they all react differently. The character building really is the biggest strength in Before We Sail, which is really saying something when the whole thing feels incredibly tight together in general, which is seriously impressive because this entire story is 45 pages long. 37 if we don't count the cover and individual chapter breaks. That's a little less than 2 issues of your average comic, and it feels like an entire 7 or 8 issue arc. I'd even go so far as to say reading through it felt like a full episode of some anthology show like Black Mirror, or even a feature-length movie. The pacing is on point, and I think all of what I just mentioned is complemented perfectly by Michelle's artwork. It's got just the right amount of muddiness and grit to it, but not to the point of overdoing it. The colors are generally more washed out to give it that sort of dour realism you'd see from a 2010s third-person shooter, which makes it stand out that much more when we do get splashes of much brighter color to sell the intensity of whatever's happening. I especially enjoy just how creative she gets with the format. In Chapter 5, the gutter space behind panels gets more and more torn as a visual metaphor for the scenario they're in getting worse by the second. I didn't really notice it until the second to last page, but once I went back, that was such a cool detail I'm not sure many people would pick up on. And the final chapter is told through journal entries as a framing device, and as such the gutter space takes on the appearance of crumpled paper, with the art itself imitating watercolor paintings despite still being done entirely digitally. Michelle didn't have to do any of this, but that attention to detail only benefits the story. There are a bunch of little touches like that, but those 2 instances are my favorite. Not to say the artwork is absolutely perfect though, I do have one nitpick. Since this is a post-apocalyptic story set in modern day, obviously people are going to be using a lot of guns, and the way guns are drawn here tends to be quite hit or miss. In most cases they look fine to even pretty good, but other times they look really awkward and more like toys than real firearms. And as a fellow artist, primarily digital as well at that, I totally get it. Guns are really annoying to draw, but when the same exact gun is drawn perfectly in one panel but a completely different shape and devoid of detail, or if a character is holding their gun in an incredibly awkward and impractical way, it tends to be a little distracting. At least for me, mileage may vary on that one. Like, Angel here completely swaps which hand he's holding the forend of his rifle with, and I can't tell what his other arm is doing because it doesn't seem to be holding onto any part of the gun itself. Like I said though, I get it. They're surprisingly tricky to draw, and if I were the artist here, after a certain point I would just say frag it and call it good enough just so the damn thing can get published. Anyway, that's really my only nitpick about the whole thing. If that's the only bit I have to complain about while reading, I think you guys have done a pretty commendable job. And if I could describe how every aspect of Before We Sail feels, it would be authentic. The characters, world, artwork all feel like an unfiltered, unrestrained work of passion from everyone involved on the team. I've never been to Lima, or Peru in general, but if you told me someone on the team just took pictures for Michelle to use as reference while they were out on a walk, I'd believe you. There's something about the locales we see that feels more real than if she drew a generic general store or a generic boatyard. Maybe I'm overthinking it, but it's just nice seeing more media take place in countries I've never been in. Helps it feel fresh. Overall, this was a great read and I'd highly Wait a second. This is called Before We Sail. So why doesn't their boat have any sails? I was expecting sails, Carlos.
You fragging liar, you fragging piece of scrap, little fragging rat.
Jokes aside, BWS really is deserving of all the praise it's gotten so far, and I highly recommend giving it a read once it's out. This really is the best example I can think of when it comes to putting your best foot forward. If you had me read this with no context, I'd wholeheartedly believe the creatives behind it were seasoned vets in the industry. Not that this is their first published work. I hope to see more of their stuff in the future. We've got a nice position with this story in that I'd love to see more of this world, whether it be some kind of prequel showing the start of the zombie outbreak, or a sequel showing what Jonathan and Kath get up to next. But at the same time, I do think this works perfectly as a standalone story. It doesn't necessarily need more, even if I would like more. Speaking of, Alberto the editor and Diego have some webcomics out right now. They are exclusively in Spanish, so you can check those out if you can read Spanish. I can't, but they look good. I haven't seen or heard of anything current or upcoming that Michelle's working on, but I do hope to see more of her art. David Lloyd is of course still doing Aces Weekly, so check that out to see all sorts of variety when it comes to indie comics. And I think I'll do just that once this video's finished. And Carlos has alluded to doing research for some upcoming projects, so he's got something he's cooking up. Can't wait to see what it is. Carlos, please, by all means, keep doing what you're doing. I can't wait to see what your next project is, and I can promise I'll be there when it comes out. But that's it for today, guys. This is Major Disaster signing off. Thank you all for watching, and make sure to do all those fun YouTube things like clicking like, leaving a comment, and subscribing. Check out everyone's stuff, links down in the description, and make sure to look away from your screen for at least 20 seconds to prevent zombies from using their own veins to climb up your apartment building.